All right, I'll get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Y también muchas gracias a mi familia, a mis amistades y a mis seres queridos que me acompañan el día de hoy. Y un agradecimiento muy especial a las mujeres que me ayudaron en este trabajo y que me acompañan el día de hoy también. And to my dissertation committee, I am very grateful to have your support today. So today I will be presenting on my dissertation, which is titled Transformative Harvests, Everyday Resistance and Relational Care in the Food and Agricultural Work of Mexican Migrant Farmworker Mothers in North Carolina. To give a quick overview, I'll be giving an introduction, then some framing for my research questions. I'll talk about my methods, my findings, and then my conclusions. To provide some context on the topic of my dissertation, women make up 28% of the migrant farm worker labor force in the United States. Yet, their contributions to the food system are often overlooked, when in fact, migrant women who are farm workers and mothers help feed their communities and society by laboring in the fields, and they also do the work of feeding their families at home. 2/3 of the 3 million farm workers in the US were born in Mexico, and over half of them are undocumented. And so this makes them prone to discrimination based on their ethnicity and also their immigration status. And so beyond substandard wages, poor housing conditions, and lack of access to primary health care, women farm workers face specific challenges related to sexual harassment, to health problems during pregnancy, and limited childcare as well. And so this means that Mexican migrant farm worker women do significant food work at home and in the fields to feed and care for their communities and families, while also facing intersectional oppression within the US food system. So a bit about my framing. My dissertation is distinctive because it brings together literature on two forms of food work. Literature on farm worker labor and literature on care and food work. So the literature on migrant farm workers in the US has generally looked at inequality in the agricultural fields. It describes the deplorable conditions that farm workers work and live in, from disregard of their human basic rights like accessible bathroom facilities and access to drinking water, to a lack of protection against pesticide poisoning and overcrowded housing. These studies generally have focused on the experience of farm worker men. On the other hand, literature on care and food work addresses the ways that mothers care for their children when they feed them and they provide nourishment for them. Yet, this literature has not looked at how women build relationships of care through their food work outside of their household. And with some exceptions, this literature has centered primarily on the experience of white middle-class mothers. Added to this, I look into literature on motherhood from a woman of color perspective. So according to this literature, the lived experience of working-class mothers of color has historically blurred social division between home and work life. And this is also the case for migrant farm worker women who perform an unremunerated care work at home while doing work outside the house that provides a form of care for society, right? So their experiences are framed by the context of their intersecting positionalities in US society as working class women of color who are migrants, who are often undocumented, and by the relationships of care that they build and shape in their everyday reality. And finally, I look at the literature on everyday resistance. So previous studies have addressed farm work resistance to oppression, mainly in the form of organized movements and unions. but it has not centered the discussion on everyday acts of resistance. We can understand these as significant acts of defiance that provide people with a sense of dignity. So a few studies have examined how migrant farm workers resist oppression by doing things like growing their own food with knowledge and skills that they've learned in their hometowns, or by preparing and sharing meals using traditional recipes and ingredients. But none of these studies have centered specifically on the ways that migrant mothers of color transform their everyday lives through their food work at home and at work. So based on this literature, my dissertation looks at how migrant farm worker mothers transform their everyday experiences with intersectional oppression through their farm and food work as an act of everyday resistance. And it also looks at the ways in which their everyday food and agricultural practices shape the relationship of care they build with themselves, their families, and their community to change this everyday reality. So, in other words, it looks specifically at the experience of Mexican migrant farm worker women in their role as mothers of color who are both food workers and caregivers, as they face intersectional oppression tied to gender, to ethnicity, to immigration status, and class. So in all, my dissertation looks at the relationship migrant farm worker women build with themselves, with their children, their co-workers, their friends, through their food work, and the ways in which they use this food work to resist hostile living environments and to shape them into spaces of care and dignity. This contributes to our understanding of how migrant Mexican farm worker mothers shape and change the US food system through their everyday food and agricultural work, even under conditions of exploitation and marginalization, through the relationships of care that they build with their loved ones. I used intersectionality as a research methodology, understanding it as a broad-based knowledge project. I did this in order to center the experience and the reflections of women of color and to discuss power relations and social inequality from this perspective. So I use some of its key precepts as oppression, power, complexity, relationality, and context, which helped me have a nuanced understanding of the Mexican migrant farm worker women's experiences and reflections. Additionally, I made myself aware of my positionality as I collected data and analyzed it. Although I closely related with the woman who participated in my research because we were Spanish speakers and we shared our Mexican nationality, my status as a university student with a visa who lived in Raleigh and marked a difference between us. So I understood my positionality within the women's that I work with the context that I worked with, as a co-ethnic, but also as an outsider. And this helped me create a complex narrative of the women's reality and of my interpretation of it. So during my data collection, I interviewed 15 participants who lived and did farm work in Duplin, Sampson, and Harnett counties in North Carolina. My participants were all women, mothers, and migrants. I contacted them through the Episcopal Farm Worker Ministry, which is an organization that supports farm workers in the area. I did a total of 19 interviews between March 2019 and March 2023. And these were divided in two sets, pre-COVID and post-COVID. The first set was done in person, while the second set had to be done by phone because of COVID-19 pandemic regulations. All of the interviews I did were conducted in Spanish, and they focused on women's work history, their agricultural knowledge and skills in Mexico and the US, their food practices at work and at home, their work conditions, their perspectives on the US food system, and their experiences with motherhood and womanhood. I also collected 7 photograph sets to do follow-up interviews with the woman, but only for participants who were able to do them. So I decided to not base my analysis on this data. However, the photographs were very helpful in conducting the interviews as a visual aid that facilitated the conversation that I had with my interviewee. I also did an autoethnography. This means that I observed and made annotations of the interactions and the context I shared with the woman I interviewed for a period of almost 4 years. So I have ethnographic notes of these events, recorded audio messages of my reflections, and I also made reflexive notes in thumbnails that I wrote after each interview. In terms of my analysis, I used grounded theory to analyze my data, which allowed my research to mainly be guided by my participants' experiences. And I also applied intersectional approach to analyze the data I collected. This approach allowed me to see that Mexican migrant farm worker mothers are not only an oppressed community, but they are also one where joy, dignity, and transformation exists. In other words, their life experiences are complex. It also showed that not all migrant farm workers have the same experiences because their lives are shaped by different contexts. And finally, it showed me that the concept of a migrant farm worker woman could be deconstructed by observing the differences in their lived experiences. And so, coming into the findings of my dissertation, I present 3 key findings. The first one is that I use an intersectional lens to show that migrant women who were mothers experienced intersection oppressions tied to gender, ethnicity, citizenship, and class, and they enacted everyday resistance through their foodwork at home and in the fields, which gave them a sense of dignity in their lives. So they resisted and gained dignity when they showed pride for the foodwork they did for their families and society, while also recognizing the struggle it entailed. So, for example, in the case of Isidra, she was someone who did work in the fields, who also did work at home, and she very consciously established that she understood the value of both of these types of work that she did. So in a sense, she valued this double burden that she had as a farm worker and as a mother. She said, I know I provide a service for society because through my work they can access products to eat at home. And I also know I provide a service to my family when I take care of my children. So Isidra recognized the value of her double burden. And by doing this, she resisted the gender narrative that made her care work invisible in some sense. The woman also practiced resistance when they reproduced food work that was culturally and ethnically significant and provided them with a sense of self-reliance. For example, in the case of Esperanza, she talks about how she woke up every morning to make handmade tortillas for herself so she could take that with her to lunch in the tobacco field where she worked. It was important for her for these tortillas to be fresh because that made them have a better flavor, right? So in this sense, by making these handmade tortillas, the woman valued and expressed their cultural food identity, making sure that they could eat the foods that they liked and that they found essential for their everyday life. And like this, they affirmed the cultural food practices and resisted the rural environment that signaled them as an unwanted outsider in the US. The second finding that I present in my dissertation is that I use the concept of relational care to show how foodwork fosters space for relationships that transform and dignify people's shared experience, even within hostile environments. So migrant farm worker women build relationships of care with their children, their community, and themselves that change their everyday lives. And they expressed this relational care when they cooked for their friends and co-workers in order to strengthen their networks and create a sense of support in a demeaning and isolating work environment in which they experienced their farm work, right? So in the case of Isabel, for example, she talks about how she was very grateful to live in the US because she was able to get to know other Latin American migrant families and to share dishes and share cultures that she would not have known if she had not moved to the US from Mexico. So Isabel, who was a mother of 4, she was a single mother who had been through a lot of hardship, expressed a lot of enthusiasm and joy of knowing that she had this community in the US. So together, Isabel and her friends transformed the context of their everyday lives by creating a sense of companionship in an environment where they feel isolated. And so migrant women were also building relationships of care with themselves when they cooked as a way of attending to their own needs and also acknowledging their own self-value. In the case of Mercedes, she talks about her favorite dish that she cooks for herself. And this is, she uses a diminutive to talk about this dish. So she says, one of my favorite foods are a nicely fried carp fish with its little fried potatoes, its little lettuce, its little avocado. And you know, this in Spanish is a term of endearment, talking in diminutive. So in this sense, Mercedes is talking about the food that she cooks for herself from a place of warmth, from a place of tenderness. And the woman also talked with admiration, with acknowledgement of their own dedication about the food that they were cooking for themselves. So by cooking these dishes and talking about them in this way, women show appreciation for the food they cook for themselves. And like this, also create a connection of self-value with themselves through the food that they're cooking, right? Finally, my third finding is that I argue that a reflexive methodology where my participants and I interact and together shaped the data collection process results in a narrative that reflects the complexity of their everyday reality. So a little bit about complexity from an intersectional perspective would refer to the understanding that a subject of study has more than one characteristic and that their conjunction produces a complex reality, right? So my participants and I worked together to understand each other's positionality during the data collection process. We did this when we had everyday interactions that helped us understand each other's identities and build trust among us. So at some point in the 4 years that I collected data with this woman, Maria Jose was having a baby, and the group of women organized a baby shower for her. At the end of the celebration, after Maria Jose's thank you speech, she lets us know that she received a letter from ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, letting her know that she was being deported in a month. So this was a situation that was very hard for her. She cried, she expressed her fear, and the woman immediately provided support, right? So they told her what to do. Many of the women had been through a situation similar to this before, so they knew what to do. I, on the other hand, could not provide this type of assistance. I had never been in a situation like that, but I could be empathic and show her support in other ways, right? Maria Jose perceived that this moment was a moment where she could be vulnerable and she could share this information with us. And at that moment, I realized that I was being trusted by this group of women, right? Being allowed to be part of this moment of collective vulnerability. So this moment, this experience also let me understand that even though we shared parts of our identity, the woman and I, because we were both immigrants in the United States, we did not live this the same way, and our positionalities were different because of that. And so the woman and I also worked together to transform the power dynamic that exists between interviewer and interviewee. I showed the participants and I partially transcended the interview power dynamic and came up with a collaborative narrative. So at the end of each interview, I would ask participants the question if they had any questions for me. And all the participants inquired about my life when I asked this question. They would ask me what my life was like, how long I had been away from my family, if I liked doing these interviews, if I liked to help people, how old I was, where I was from, where I lived, all questions that had to do with my everyday life. None of the women denied the opportunity to ask me questions about myself. And they all took this space to become interviewers in the conversation that we were having. So this instance allowed me to see how participants were actively guiding the conversation and also playing the part of the interviewer. By asking each other questions, then my participants and I were able to somehow reshape the interviewer and interviewee power dynamic. So to conclude, I argue that women's foodwork is essentially relational and transformational. It's relational because women build and shape relationships of care with others and themselves through the acts of procuring and cooking food. So this means that foodwork is not only an isolated act of labor where a woman gives care by providing food for someone. It is also an interactive connection where woman cooking for another person has an effect on that person's physical well-being and their life in general. So for example, a mother who cooks a homemade Mexican meal for her child, she's intending to keep her healthy and to introduce her to flavors of her cultural identity, right? But the woman is also affected by this interaction. It also shapes her well-being and her life experiences and her foodwork. So this same child will maybe introduce her mother to new flavors and recipes. And this way, she will transform her mother's foodwork as well. In this sense, foodwork is not only an act of care a woman provides for others, but also a complex relationship that shapes people's lives. I also argue that a woman's foodwork is transformational. This is because it can shape and change the environments where women interact with others through their food practices. This means that women can use their foodwork to improve the life of the people around them, their family, their friends, their co-workers, specifically when they live under conditions of oppression. So for example, a farmworker woman will share a meal with her friend to talk about issues she's having at work. And this space of vulnerability will make both women feel less isolated and also more supported by each other. This also means that women can use their foodwork, the everyday practice of connecting with others through food, as a way to stand against discrimination that they experience and also provide themselves and their loved ones with a sense of dignity. So a migrant woman who cooks herself her favorite dish from her hometown will connect her migration story and her sense of resilience when she eats it, giving herself a sense of dignity every time that she cooks this for herself. In this way, foodwork is an act of care that improves and transforms people's interactions with oppression. And so just to end, the literature on foodwork has centered on the relationships women build with their children through this type of care. So using a relational lens, we can expand the literature to include the ways that women connect with their extended family, their friends, their co-workers, and their community. And even the ways that they connect and provide care with themselves through their cooking. Thus, foodwork is not only labor, it is also an act of connection with others and ourselves. And the literature has also discussed the limitations working class women and women of color have when they want to feed their child in the ways that they would like to. So my argument can expand on this literature by looking at the ways that migrant mothers use their foodwork to improve and transform their children's everyday lives, Even more, the literature can also look at the ways that migrant women improve the lives of other women through the acts of cooking and sharing food, and create networks of resilience among them through this. So in this sense, foodwork becomes an act of transformation that improves people's everyday lives. And that is all. Thank you, everyone.
Why don't you have a sip of water while you get ready for the questions?
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just gonna switch my view. I'm going to keep the recording on so that you have this unless anyone objects. If someone does object, please just send me a message and then we will turn the recording off. So you can
Okay.
send just a private message. Okay, so now we will open it up for questions from the committee and can go in any order you all would like. So if anyone would like to go first, you can.
I'll go.
Thank you, Michelle.
Sure. Wonderful job, Emilia. As usual, I'm learning a lot, and particularly because I'm not a sociologist, more in the production realm. So I really enjoyed the human dimension of things. And, you know, in this dissertation and your work, it got me thinking a lot about a resistance, what it is, and about this quote, you know, where there's power, there's resistance. And at first I was thinking about it in terms of physics, you know, the ability not to be affected, bent by a force. And then also the human dimension, refusal to comply or accept. And it got me thinking about where there's resistance, there is power, part of things, the opposite, which gets me to my question in this everyday resistance. But I guess the main thing is what counts as everyday resistance when it seems that many or all expressions of deviation could be labeled as everyday resistance. So I'll just leave it there for you.
Okay. Can I go ahead? Yeah. So I guess from the literature that I read, which includes people that discussed everyday resistance as a concept that they built by studying groups of people, to also scholars of color who talk about it from their own experiences and perspectives, thinking about it also as racialized scholars. What I understand that everyday resistance is in this sense, which is not the same as any type of resistance, right? So there is this this qualification of the everyday actions that people take to resist power. And I think here this is what mattered to my research, and what was important for me to highlight is that people can, in their everyday life, express resistance to power. So we generally understand resistance in more kind of, I would say, political ways when we think about social movements, when we think about how people have organized themselves throughout history to resist power. But for me, it was important to signal that there are other ways in which people stand to power. And so the fact that in everyday action, like, for example, cooking for yourself when you live in a situation that might not be the most comfortable, maybe when you don't have the best kitchen or the best ingredients, but you're making a dish that you know that you like and that makes you feel good. It's a way to use your everyday life to resist power. And so I'm guessing there are many things that can signify what resistance is. But in the case of my dissertation, in the case of what I observed working with this group of women, was that there is also empowerment, there is also dignity, which for me and the literature that I read are the ways in which we can resist oppression, resist power through our everyday life. So I guess in short, what I would say is that in the case of my dissertation, what resistance is these actions within everyday life that provide us with dignity and provide us with the I guess the empowerment to say that you are also a valuable human being in this world. Yes, I think that's my response to that.
Thank you, Emilia.
Celeste.
Oh, go ahead.
Or Pam.
Go ahead, Celeste.
Hi, Emilia. Thank you so much for this fabulous dissertation. Like always, I learned a lot, and I just love to see where, I mean, I haven't seen you in a while, right? So it's like, it's nice to see where it has gone. And of course, it remains brilliant. I really was interested in the question about everyday resistance as well. And I guess I would like to ask you kind of a similar question, which is, so what is missed when we're thinking about your work? What would be missed if we focus on the more organized aspects of resistance that's typically discussed? Because I do think like resistance studies scholars like Stellan Van Hagen and all them, it says confirm my speaking language.
Oh,
Okay. I don't know what just happened, but anyway, you know, you're so right. They make this argument that there is like this everyday type of resistance that occurs. So what is missed if we only focus on this other type, the more kind of organized resistance that we're familiar with in the literature? And then secondly, I guess I'm curious if the type of resistance that you're focusing on, can it become, or is it just one or the other? Or like, how are you thinking about it in terms of your own work, right?
Right.
And I might have a follow-up question, but I don't know. I feel like you have it there, so I'd love to hear it.
Great, thank you, Celeste. Thank you for that question, and it's nice to see you again as well. Okay, so with the experience that I had working with a group of women that I interviewed, and knowing the literature on farm worker resistance, also being involved in other organizations that dealt with farm workers, I understood that farm workers resisted in organized ways. But when I met with this group of women, I realized that they weren't so much involved in that kind of resistance, which was organized, like movements, like unions. So I wondered if as a sociological question, I wondered, why are women not involved in this type of resistance? What are the ways in which women express resistance from other environments, not necessarily through unions, through political movements, even though they are also many times involved in those. So I think my participants led me to understand that that when many times people who live under oppression are not do not feel safe enough, do not feel how would I say this? They don't feel strong enough to participate in these other types of movements. What they will do is resist from their own everyday life. So I think when the literature has focused on the type of resistance that Celeste is asking me about, so social movements, unions, other types of organized resistance, it misses to see that maybe less privileged groups of people have other ways in which they resist. So in the end, if we bring these two types of resistance together, we can see that resistance in itself is complex, right? That there's not only that type of resistance that is expressed politically through social movements, there's also a type of resistance that we see in the everyday life. And when we observe them together, we can have like a better understanding of how people respond to power and people respond to oppression. So just kind of like rephrasing to respond to your question more clearly, I think that the types of resistance that are not visibilized when we center our attention on social movements and unions are these types of resistance that come, I would say, from down up, right? That are made maybe in community, that are not necessarily created through a political is the understanding of a situation, but from an everyday life understanding of what power is and oppression is. And I think visibilizing that type of resistance is very important because, answering the second part of your question, it can create stronger ways of standing to oppression and standing to discrimination and standing to power, because it is built on community, it is built on the everyday activities of people. And so kind of like thinking of how intersectionality has this action-oriented is the part, this part of intersectionality that is action-oriented. I would say that by understanding that everyday resistance is an important part in the lives of people that live in intersectional oppression, we can see how that can be a seed that creates transformation and creates change. A starting point in many moments, right? Maybe we don't observe it as a whole movement, but I do feel that at least the woman that I worked with change and transform people's lives every day. And that is the base of many of the transformations that are needed in the US food system, at least. So yes, I think that's my response.
Andrea, did you have a question? Then we
I
have
did,
Kim.
But was Kim, did Kim have a question first?
Well, you answered it, Amelia. I was just gonna say, this is more of a comment than a question, but it's, but because you already answered my question based on Michelle's and Celeste's question, because, I think that your research is it's like a really good combination of like Sarah's and Celeste's, like areas of research, but then you build from that, obviously, with the everyday resistance contribution. And I'm no expert in most of the areas in your dissertation, but I dabble in social movements, and I think that like a major problem in social movements research is that it's kind of known as notoriously known as hairy-chested sociology. It focuses on these big processes, huge ideas, major transformations, and a lot of the men that are in this area, like, only focus on these huge public, forms of collective action and social movements and things like that. And so, traditionally this field, it critiques this research on everyday resistance. And so, you have already shown in your written work and also today in your responses, how focusing on everyday resistance can contribute to this literature. But moving forward, think about how, like, you could possibly build up and contribute to lots of different areas of research. And I was thinking, as you were talking about, like, the work area, and they also privilege these, like unionization as the only form of like major collective action that's actually going to do anything, or like I forgot where I was going with that, but anyway, like, I was thinking of the other major lines of work area that like Martha does on dignity at work, and how maybe your research could contribute to that area of research. But like I was saying, like, you could contribute to a bunch of different places that you that could be a place of, like, for you to build upon for future research or future articles or books or stuff like that, including things like work, social movements, mother work, like, as you talk about a little bit in your research, but like globalization and migration, gendered, racialized migration. Anyway, so where are you going next? Like, what are you, and you don't have to answer this now, but because I know Andrew has a question, but before the end of this defense, talk about where you are going next with your research, please.
All right.
I think it's okay to answer it now if you want, and then you can answer it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Kim, for that. I think there is literature that maybe I didn't go deeply into that. I still would love to connect with through this type of research that I'm doing. And I guess, where am I going next with this findings that my dissertation produced, and also what other things were kind of left in the data that I would have liked to explore a little bit more. I was very interested in the way that a woman connected to a sense of resilience and of self-value through their food work. And I think that's something that in the literature on food work hasn't been explored as deeply. And specifically in the case of migrant women, a woman that experience oppression in their everyday lives, I think that the ways that they connect to food, and the ways that, in this sense, food gives them self-value, would be something that would be very significant, and that also connects to resistance in other ways, but also in the ways that women connect emotionally to themselves through their food work, through their food labor. I think that's a topic that I would like to explore further. In this sense of what we were talking about, like the literature that you're talking about, the hairy-chested literature on resistance. Another kind of topic that came up during my dissertation and the data collection that I wasn't able to explore as much is the way that foodwork creates networks between women. So in this sense, if we talk about everyday resistance, if we talk about organizing, kind of like maybe expanding on what Celeste was asking, is what does this everyday resistance build? I think that when women connect through their food work, when women connect through food, they create moments of resilience, of solidarity, that build spaces of power for themselves. So I think this is a very important kind of como subject that hasn't been looked at so much is how women connect with through their cooking. No, I think an example of like a group of women being in a kitchen and the things that we talk about when we're there together, and how that could become a social movement in itself, right? But it begins with that connection through food. And so I think that would be another topic that I would be very interested in expanding on. The gendered solidarity, the resilience that is built through our food work in groups of women. So yeah, I think those are the two things that I would expand on from this research.
Andrea.
So I'm gonna sneak two questions in here. I really appreciated reading your dissertation and hearing you talk about it. So I'm very happy to be here and be the small part. On the topic of everyday resistance, do the women experience this as resistance themselves, or is this something that, you know, they're just kind of doing and you identify it as resistance through your analysis? And how might either of those matter in terms of how you're thinking about particularly building solidarity and so on? And then my other question, so I'm not a food scholar, but could you talk a little bit more about how the women's relationship with food is shaped specifically by being farm workers, and how their relationship to food might be different than other immigrant mothers who are not also farm workers?
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, for those questions. So to your first question, the word resistance was not used by the woman when they talked about this, but the words that come out of this literature on everyday resistance, like what resistance produces where. So the woman did talk about dignity. They did talk about, you know, their self-value. They did talk about the value of their work. They did talk about their resilience. And so in itself, resistance as a concept was not used, but I could identify that the women were getting at these ideas of dignity, of resilience, of self-value through these acts that I analyzed. So I think that was an important kind of like connection with the literature and the data collection, where those things came together in this way, having not necessarily the concept of resistance, of everyday resistance, but yes, the concepts that signify this resistance, right? And in terms of your second question, can you remind me what your second question was? I'm sorry. Can you rephrase your second question again? I forgot.
How does being a farm worker shape the women's relationship to food?
Right.
And food.
So in my analysis, something that I wanted to highlight was that women's food work does not only exist at home, which is how kind of like the food work and care work literature defines it. In the case of a woman who also do work that has to do with food outside the house, that can also be a part of the definition of what food work is. So when I talked about, you know, Mexican migrant farm worker women do food work at home and in the fields, I found that there was kind of like an important a fusion connection between the fact that they were feeding society, they were working to feed society outside their household, but also working to feed their families, their children, themselves in their home. And so both of these ways in which they worked with food to care for others created a very specific context for them and a very specific case of how these women were observing the care that they were providing through their food work, right? So I think at the beginning, I talked a little bit and I quoted someone who says, I know that the work that I do with food in the fields feeds society. And I also know that the work that I do with food at home feeds my children. So women were very conscious of the ways in which the agricultural work that they did was very valuable because it fed other families, it fed other people. And at the same time, the work that they did at home, feeding their kids, was very valuable to themselves, to their children, to their family. So I think in this sense, the fact that they knew, they were aware that these two types of food work were part of the care that they were providing to the people around them is very significant for this case.
I'm wondering, I kind of have two questions too, but one is just a follow up, because I think there were some examples, and I should ask about this earlier, but like that the actual food or the food practices shaped how they cooked. Like basically, maybe you are picking sweet potatoes, so you start cooking with sweet potatoes, or just that you have access to these farms, so that shapes how you cook. Were there any examples of just like in practical terms of how the fact that people were working as farm workers shaped how they cooked for their families? We have lots of examples even in the presentation of how their food work shaped at home, shaped their workplace, but did it go the other way too?
There is one example I can think of. The woman at some point talked about food that they collected from the fields that they worked at. So they talk about flor de calabaza, pumpkin flower, and how for Mexican traditional dishes, this is a very important ingredient. It's a delicacy, right? So it's a very a valued ingredient. And they realized that the farmers that they were working with weren't eating them. That wasn't an ingredient that farmers, American farmers, would eat. They called them, American farmers. And so several of them told me how they would ask permission to take this ingredients from the fields and bring them home and cook in a festive way, right? Because this ingredient was something that was not very accessible to them in other ways. So in this sense, working as farm worker women, they had access to ingredients that maybe other people didn't because they can't find them at stores as easily. And they did because they worked directly with these plants. They also talked about, for example, cooking with the camote, the sweet potato, and how there were a few women who talked about candied sweet potato and how this is also a very special dessert that people eat in several regions of Mexico. And so being able to have that when there was leftover in the fields, because many of the women told me about how when there were leftovers in the fields, the farmers many times allowed them to take that extra produce home. And so being able to cook these candied sweet potato was also something that kind of happened because they had access to these extra sweet potatoes from work. And so in this sense, I think that again, working as farm workers, they had in a way special access to foods that maybe other still Mexican communities might not had, because they weren't working in the fields directly with this type of produce.
Thank you. And I just have one question because we've talked a lot about your dissertation. But since I'm the sociologist of food, I feel I have to represent. And there is a lot of literature on cooking and motherhood in this, as you know, especially within the last 5 to 10 years. But I think you are totally new, totally fresh. You are contributing so much to that literature. So my question for you is, what do you think is the most important thing you're saying back to that literature, or the thing you're doing that is different, or the finding that is different from all these other studies, which, as you point out, tend to be with definitely not farm workers. A lot of them are white middle class moms, not all, but I think your approach is totally different. So what would you say is your most innovative contribution, or what would you want to say to that literature?
I think that I guess the fact that even though the literature on care work and food work already touches on these topics, understanding it beyond and beyond a labor, beyond the fact that it's labor. So we know that food work is labor, right? Food work takes time. Food work takes energy. For women, it also takes like emotions, mental work as well. And this is very important, and this is a very important finding that the literature on food work and care work and motherhood has had. I think that thinking about food work as relational and transformational, like together, allows us to see that food work, including being this labor that is very important and that takes a lot of energy, it's also generative. It also produces other situations. It also transforms the spaces. It also builds relationships. So in this sense, food work is not only this labor that many times in the literature has been portrayed as limiting, as burdensome, as something that has, many times maybe held mothers in spaces that are not as comfortable, as positive. Food work can also be a place of creation, of construction, of creativity, of love, of care in all these ways as well. And so I think that would be the contribution that my findings are making to the literature. The fact that food work being work is also work that can generate new things, new dynamics, new experiences for people, and that looking at that also allows us to see the complexity of what food work is, because it is both things at the same time. Food work is labor, food work is hard, food work is burdensome and limiting, and food work is also transformational. It's also generative. It also creates relationships. It's also a way that we show love to each other, and that is something that happens simultaneously. And so understanding that, I think, kind of broadens the scope of what food work is and that literature. Yes.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Celeste.
Well, I can't hear.
I mean,
You would think I know how to do this, right? Like Zoom for all these years, but anyway, so it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. I just want to emphasize that your response there was just like brilliant, and I think that you can really think about in your future research, really highlighting that even more, because similar to what Kim said, there's these different literatures that you're pulling from. So like if you even think about care work in general, right? So care obviously is labor, as we know, but care is also a really important, beautiful, wonderful event, activity that societies need to thrive, right? And so there are folks who kind of look at like philosophies of care, like Joan Toronto is like one person I'm thinking about, but they're kind of more in like the philosophy end, but they speak to a lot of the literature on care work. And many folks who do care work, they kind of speak back to that literature as well, which is like, you know, this is a democratic thing. It should be, right? When we're thinking about care. So maybe that's like one thing that you can kind of punch through even more, which is that, you know, care matters, and that when we think about maybe some of the literature that might have some second wave feminist orientations in it, which is that, you know, food is burdensome, which it is, right? Because there's real things in terms of gendered expectations of care and how it falls unevenly within families, and women are far more likely to have to take on this labor and, you know, food accessibility and all that type of stuff. But at the same very time, like you said, it's still a really valuable and important activity, right? It helps generations thrive. And I think in some ways, your participants are expressing this ethic of care, not only in the food work, not only in the food that they create, but also when they're thinking about their own position as workers, right? And laborers of food, farm work, you know? So it's like, you know, they're like, we basically, our labor, although it is stigmatized, right? They're speaking back to that stigmatization, although it is underpaid and there's all these different exploitative conditions, they're making this, they're stating, we have an ethic of care and we recognize that this is important and valuable, not only in my own home, but also within society. So that right there is like powerful, right? And yeah, I think you can punch that even through in your future work. And that's how maybe that's how you mobilize people, you know what I mean? But so anyways, I just wanted to say, like you said it all there, it's all in this dissertation. You said it in all your responses today, everything I was thinking of. So I don't have that many questions, but I just want to like, you know, take a moment to congratulate that is what I hear. And I think that is something that can be even pushed forward in your work.
Right. Thank you, Celeste.
Andrew.
So you said that you ultimately decided not to include the photo voice in your dissertation, but can you talk a little bit about what you learned through that process, both like empirically and methodologically?
Yes. Thank you, Andrea, for that question. I decided not to include the photo voice in the end. My research had several different moments of transformation, and that was important for the research itself, and also kind of helped me understand what I was trying to say and how to say it. So at the beginning of this project, of this what became my dissertation, it was before the COVID-19 pandemic even. I found that a photo voice might be a methodology that could allow me to kind of help portray the voices of the woman that I was interviewing in a more contextualized way, much more nuanced, much more kind of connected also to their own expressions of who they were. photo voice, as a way that I researched it, is a feminist methodology that has been used to allow communities to express their reality, to express the context of who they are through photographs. And then in many of the photo voice research that I read, these photographs are then used in exhibitions to show the communities themselves what the interviewees have been talking about, what the people want to express through these photographs. So in the process that I had during my research, because it was part of the process of my research, I asked the woman that I interviewed to take a daily photo of their everyday life through in a week, right? So they would provide 7 photos, a daily photo of their everyday life, specifically their food practices. So if they were cooking, if they wanted me to see a festivity, anything that had to do with food. And then the second part of this process was an interview that was based on these photographs. And so on that second interview, we would go into the photographs that they had shared with me. We would kind of like address some of the guiding questions that I had, but mainly through the photographs, they would kind of share with me what their everyday food work looked like. There came a point where a woman did not have the time to do the second interview with me, even though they had shared photographs. So I kind of like have analysis of those photographs because I observed them. I kind of used them in a way to contextualize what I had learned from them in the first interview. And then with the 4 women that I was able to do the follow-up interviews, we had those conversations through the photographs, as I explained. I felt that I could not use that data in itself as such as the photographs, because I only had 4 participants talk about them in that way. So I guess what I kind of thought in my research process was that the cycle wasn't closed for all of them, so that data wasn't complete in that sense. However, the photographs were very useful in contextualizing what I was observing from the first interview, what the woman had talked about in the first interview, and then for the woman in the second interview, well, we based the interview on those photographs. So I think photo voice is a very useful method. It's also a method that in my research kind of like got interrupted because of the pandemic. And so I had to kind of transform my research in that sense. And I think these are things that are important to talk about when we talk about research, because many times, at least as a PhD student, I didn't always hear people talk about the transformations that their research went through. And so that is what happened in my case with the photo voice interviews and the photographs.
Thank you.
Michelle.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Emilia. Thank you, Andrea. I was actually curious about the photo voice too, so thank you for the question. I actually think there's a lot of real value in the photo voice, because it perhaps for me was the least biased. It is from the perspective of the participants, their lens, and through the interview, kind of their interpretation. So I'd love to see that develop more. But my question, another question is, I can't help but think about the pandemic and your unique timing of your research, kind of before and then during. And so I'm wondering, certainly the pandemic affected the participants' lives, their food work. I wonder if you could speak to that, and do you think it impacted some of this resistance or everyday resistance?
Thank you, Michelle. I think that was also important data that was collected, but because of the way that my research kind of evolved, there was a point where asking about the pandemic and the food practices and the experiences that the woman had during the pandemic was not, I guess, as fresh in their lives anymore. So I did several interviews right after the pandemic and during it, and the woman talked about what was going on in their lives and how it affected, mostly like it affected everyone's, in the ways of like how we bought food, like how we connected to the outside world. And several of them also talked about their own work experience, right? So during the pandemic, they were given certain permits where they were allowed to go out. They were not stopped. If they were outside, they would just say, I'm a farm worker. I have, to go to work. A lot of the comments also had to do with fear on what was going on. Many of the women have partners, and so in many of their life situations, their partners are the ones that are kind of like in charge of providing for the household. And so many of the women stopped working when the pandemic happened, and it was their partners who would go out and work. And so many of the women did not speak about, like themselves as farm workers during that time, because they were staying home with the kids, taking care of their children, and their partners were the ones going out. There were a few women that were also single mothers, and they did have to go out to work during that time. And so those differences were also important to understand, at least during the period of the pandemic. Many of them got sick, so they would talk about the situations. But as I said, kind of including this in my dissertation, I wasn't as specific about including what had happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, because I thought that the topics that were coming out of it were still, I was able to still talk about the topics that were coming out through it without having to make it a situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. And also because I didn't interview most of the women during that time. So a lot of the information that I collected kind of happened in the years before and much afterwards. Right. Yes. Did I answer your question? I think I got lost there a little bit.
Okay. I do think I do think the pandemic did probably influence care, and I think it's okay to recognize that. At some level, it's a bit hard, but I wouldn't exclude it, perhaps.
Do we have other questions? Okay, well then we will attempt to put the committee into the room again, and everyone can just wait. So just wait a few minutes.
Okay.
I think that everyone who was in room 2 before can join. Can you join room 2 again? It kind of says you're still in it. So maybe if you, can you click on that? Oh, yeah. Okay, see you in a minute.